Welcome to the Move 101 podcast. In today's episode, we sat down with Larry Hagner, founder of The Dad Edge. Larry grew up in an environment where half of his childhood was spent without a father figure, the other half spent with toxic father figures that came and went. When his first son was born, Larry found out quickly that he didn't have the skills to be the best for his son. He was short on patience, quick to anger, and his marriage was mediocre at best. He's since had 3 more boys with his wife, Jessica, and has dedicated his working life to learning the skills necessary to be the husband and father he wished he had growing up, as well as teaching those skills to other fathers as well. The Dad Edge empowers men to create legendary marriages, epic connections with their kids, master personal finance, optimize their physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health, and become a leader within their family. Larry's platform includes a book and podcast of the same title, and he's interviewed more than 700 experts dedicated to improving the lives of fathers. His mission is to help you become the best, strongest, and happiest version of yourself so that you can guide your kids to be the best version of themselves. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Well, Larry Hagner, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, man, it's good to be here. Andrew, good to meet you. And Levi, that mustache is on point, man.
Thank you. I'm trying to keep it tight. I did shave last night just for this, so it's a special occasion.
I admit I'm a little jealous of it as well. I can't grow facial hair too well, but Levi's got it rocking over there. So thanks for pointing that out.
Good, man.
I'll grow some for you, so don't worry.
He works with the fire community quite a bit, so he fits in really well with the tactical community.
Yeah.
Well, Larry, we just finished reading your book, The Dad's Edge. Fantastic book. We really enjoy getting into some of this stuff about parenting and how we can be better parents, better dads in this case in particular. But I think there's a lot of good stuff that we'll get into on the realm of fatherhood, parenthood. But before we do that, I'm curious, could you give our listeners a little bit of an idea? There's quite a narrative arc, let's say, of where you came from, your childhood, and some of the stuff you went through, missing your biological father, to where you are now as someone who was working with men to become better dads. So I'm curious if you could just give us the breakdown, give us our listeners the breakdown of kind of what that story looked like and what brought you to this point.
Yeah, I'll kind of fly right through it. It's a rather long story, but I'll make it concise. But my mom and biological father were married like really young. They were like kids, like 21. 1971. I was born in 1975. They were married for 4 years. As soon as basically right when I was born, it only took about a year, and then they were divorced. And I have no recollection of my biological father, none. In fact, it was just me and my mom until I was of the age of 4. So no recollection of my father. Funny thing is when I was 4, I still remember this. I was in preschool. I remember dads coming to pick up their kids, and I knew what a dad was, and I knew I didn't have one. Didn't bother me much though, because in my 4-year-old mind, I thought moms just go out and find dads, and my mom hadn't found our dad yet. And that was fine. Like, she'll find him eventually. I'll never forget, 4 years old, my mom told me one day, she's like, "Hey, I'm having a friend over for dinner tonight, and I want you to meet him. He's a very special friend. He's a very nice man. I want you to meet him." And that was her way of saying, "I've been dating somebody, and it's time for you to meet him."
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I was like, oh my gosh, like my first thought was like, she found him, like she found my dad. Right. So this guy comes walking in, 1979. He's wearing like a 3-piece suit. He was a white collar data software engineer. He had a mustache, Levi mustache.
There you go.
Yeah, man.
Representing.
He had feathered hair, briefcase, the whole 9 yards. He comes walking in. I still remember like the feeling of this man walking in my house. And like I shook his hand, and me being just 4 years old, I just looked at him with these big bright eyes. And the first thing that came out of my mouth was, "Are you going to be my dad?" And I still remember like the awkward feeling. The guy was just like, "Oh my God." Right. But I think my mom kind of took that as a sign, to be honest. And, she married him like 6 months later. And I was in the wedding. I had a blue tuxedo, like Dumb and Dumber. I'm like, oh my
Solid.
God. Right. What was my mom thinking? But I was so happy, man. I was like, oh my gosh, like family complete. Right. And my dad was a very nice man when he was sober, but he did drink a lot, and my mom drank a lot, and they were married for 6 years. Every year they were together, it just got worse and worse and worse. He had a very heavy hand. He hit a lot. Back then, hitting was it was pretty common though, too, at the same time. It was just like, yeah, my dad hits me, like the belt, the spanking, you slap to the face. Like back then it was more common. Now it's like sacrilege, right? But he was pretty heavy handed. drunk a lot. My mom, same thing. Cops were called to my house a few times. Like that was kind of the norm. It was kind of crazy that was quote unquote the norm. When I was 10, they got divorced. He left. I have never seen him since. In fact, I found out about 9 years ago he died, and but never saw him since. So it was right around that age I started asking questions like, wait a second, like where did I come from? Like I know about the birds and the bees, like where did I come from? And I asked my mom, like, where did I come from? And she's like, I was actually married before, your dad. And I was like, I'm sorry, what? Like I had no idea. She got out the wedding album and there he was. I was like, wow, that's crazy. I kind of look like this guy a little bit. And it just was very surreal. And so fast forward till I was 12, I actually had an accidental opportunity to meet him. And I can go into the details if you want, but it was pretty surreal. But I ended up meeting him when I was 12. And man, I was so happy. I think when you're 12 and you're a boy, you want a dad. And you want a dad so badly. Like there's that tremendous need because you're like boy almost going into manhood. And my dad was remarried at the time. He had a 2-year-old son, another one on the way. And he lived like 3 miles from us. Had no idea. Came to my little league games. We hung out every week. Like I was always at his house. And about 5 months into our relationship, things started to kind of change and slip. And the best way I can describe it was this energy that I kind of picked up from him. The best way I can describe the energy is it felt like he was overwhelmed or heavy or something was just always on his mind. The best way I can describe it is imagine, and we've all gone through this, the time that you've been dating a woman and she's not into you anymore. She hasn't told you yet, but you know it's coming. Like how's the feeling?
We've been there.
Right. We've all been there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Wait, what do you guys mean? What are you talking about? No way.
Levi's like, it has never happened to me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I've done that to other people, but never.
Yeah, exactly. No.
But, I remember calling him, 12 years old. I remember picking up the phone and I'm like, I want to get to the bottom of this. And so I call him and I'm like, hey man, like, is everything okay? Like, I just sort of sense like something. And then he's like, basically he said, it's me, it's not you, it's complicated. I'm trying to start my life over. I can't really do this. And that was his way of basically like ending the relationship. And that was hard. So I lost him once, lost him again. And then my mom, I spiraled, man. I failed the 8th grade. I had to do 8th grade twice. I just gave up on school. I overate, got really fat. I just gave up and I ended up doing 8th grade again, went to high school, went to college, got my degree. My mom continued to date and got married one more time. So she was married 3 times total. And there was tons of men who were just in and out. And they were always the same dude, man. Same dude, different face, different name, just toxic partier, drinker, abuser, like just absolute ridiculous crap that happened. So, graduated college, went on to medical device sales, married my college sweetheart, still married to this day. So the story kind of ends here, or I guess I should say it begins here. I'm 30 years old. Expecting my first son, had been married for a couple years. I'm in a Starbucks here in St. Louis. I'm at a weekly meeting with me and my sales team. And who comes walking in for his morning coffee? My dad. I hadn't seen him since I was 12. And I make my dad sound like a bum. He's not. He's actually an insanely successful businessman and still married to the same woman to this day that he was then. I have 2 younger half brothers, but he came walking in and I think I probably had a look on my face like I had saw a ghost because one of the women who worked with me at the time like looked at me. She's like, "Are you all right?" And I'm like, "Yeah." I was like, "My father just walked in here," and she's like, "I'm sorry, what?" And I'm like, "My father." And she knew the story. She's like the one you haven't seen since you were 12. And I'm like, "Yeah." She's like, "Where is he?" I was like, "He's right there." She's like, "Holy shit!" And then of course the meeting just stopped. And she's like, "What do you do?" I was like, "What do you mean? What am I going to do?" And she's like, "What are you going to say?" I was like, "Nothing." She's like, "You're going to let your dad walk out of here without saying anything to him? You haven't seen him in 18 years. I'm like, "Yeah,
100%.
100%. That's the plan."
Yeah.
Well, she wasn't having any of that. So without one word, she just gets up and walks right over to him and sits down at his table. And I was like, what in the hell is happening right now? I see them talking and I'm like sitting there like, do I leave? Do I run? Do I go to the bathroom? Like, what do I do? And then all of a sudden I see my dad like look around and he saw me and I saw him and he just like took this deep breath, stood up and just humbly walked over and he extended his hand. He's like, hey, how are you? And I'm like, and I just looked at him. I'm like, fine. How are you? I wasn't a total asshole, but I wasn't nice either. I was sort of in between. And he's like, do you mind if I sit down? And I'm like, sure. And he's like, he saw my ring and he thought I was married to the woman that I was with. He's like, are you guys married? I was like, no. I was like, we work together. I was like, I'm married. I'm actually expecting a son here in a few months. And he's like, oh, he's like, what do you do? And I told him, and we started going back and forth. He's like, we should really get together. And I think I kind of looked at him and I was like, you don't have to do this.
Mhm.
He's like, no. He's like, I want to. And I'm like, you don't have to. And he's like, well, we should get together for breakfast. I was like, I'll tell you what. And I pulled out my business card and I was like, here's my card. If you want to get together, you can contact me. And I was just kind of cold to him and stuff like that. Kind of like a screw you. And I have never heard a chicken on a podcast, by the way. That is hilarious. Our
Sorry, I'm trying to mute it. It's our ambiance. It's our part of our crew. It's Rocky.
That's our
Rooster,
mascot.
so.
Dude, that's amazing. And not only is he a man of the mustache, but he also has roosters in the background.
There's going to be a chainsaw going here pretty soon and a bulldozer going, I promise you. So yeah,
it's all good. It's all
so
great.
anyways.
So yeah, anyways, we ended up having breakfast, and here we are 17 years later. We've got a good relationship. And I have two younger half brothers. He's still married to the same woman, has been for over 40 years. And that is what it is. And that was my childhood.
Did you get a chance to kind of get into that with him about like, hey, what happened? Like what, basically kind of getting his side of the story as well?
I totally did.
Yeah.
So I'll two situations. So when we did decide to go to breakfast, I was so nervous, man. And I was just, I'm sitting there and I felt like I was asking my dad, like, rapid fire interview questions, just because I was so nervous. I didn't know what to say or do. So I just started asking him questions. And I'll never forget that we were sitting there and I stopped and I was like, I'm sorry, man. I was like, I got to be honest with you, man. I was like, I'm asking you a bunch of questions and it's because I don't know what I should ask, what I can ask, what we can talk about, what we can't. I was like, I don't know how to do this. And my dad like leaned in and he goes, and you think I do?
Right.
And in that moment, I saw my dad as just another human being. And I was like, wow, he doesn't know what to do either. So that's pretty cool. So we ended up hanging out for a few months, getting to know each other. And then one night I called him and I'm like, hey man, I was like, let's go out to dinner one night. And he's like, okay. And he knew it was coming. So I sat him down and we, kind of had small talk and I looked at him and I said, listen, and he kind of smiled because he's like, he knew, he's like, I know why you asked me to dinner. And I was like, listen, I just want to talk about this one time and then I just want to move on from it. And I just want it to be raw and I want it to be real. And I just want to know some information. He's like, go for it. What do you got? And I said, can you please tell me what the hell happened when I was little? And then can you please tell me why you left again when I was 12? I don't understand. I don't understand. And especially now that I have my own kids, what the hell were you thinking? Like I was pissed. And my dad was like, yeah, you got every right to be mad. He goes, worst two things I've ever done in my entire life. And my dad just owned it. He was like, I thought it was right at the time. He's like, when you were a baby, he's like, you didn't want to be with me. Every time I came he's like, you don't remember this, but every time I came to pick you up, like you just wanted your mom. He's like, and then when she got remarried when you were 4, I had to sign over parental rights. And that was horrible for me. He's like, I actually thought I was giving you a gift of a normal life. He's like, I didn't think that this guy was a freaking alcoholic psychopath, right? Who was hitting you. He's like, I actually thought I was doing good. He's like, and then when you were 12, he's like, I had one son, 2 years old. My wife was pregnant. We'd been married for a handful of years. I was trying to start over. It was so complicated. Your mom was being really complicated. It was so much stress and it was so overwhelming. It was overwhelming for my wife. And he's like, I felt like I had to make that decision because it was a decision for everybody else and not for me. He's like, and it was the wrong one. And my dad just owned the hell out of it. And I was like, okay. I was like, well, let's not talk about the past anymore. Let's bury it. And let's just, what can we create moving forward? And that's what we've done. That's totally what we've done.
Yeah. So, wow. I guess so. Okay. So take me from there to now you're working with dads. But I guess before we even get to that point, you mentioned you had a child on the way.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you kind of think through that? Taking back to that time when you're thinking of how do I be a dad? Because all you've known to that point was chaos
Yeah.
in that father role. Where did you get some of those keys? How did you become a dad? And well, that's the wrong question. I know birds and bees, right? We got that part, but you know what I mean. A father. Where did some of that come from, and how do you transition from chaos into trying to lead a family?
It wasn't pretty. It was not pretty, man. I'll tell you this though. My intention and my motivation to be a good dad and husband was always there. Like I desperately wanted it because I felt the effects of how horrible it was to not have it. So it was insanely important to me to get it right. In fact, it was kind of funny. My wife and I were dating for 7 years before I asked her to marry me. 7 years. Like all of her friends were just like, I was like that guy that they would just tear into. Like, when are you going to ask my friend to marry you? Like all this other stuff. And like, I was like, when I'm sure, because I was just like, I don't want to be divorced. Like, I don't want that. I'm not going to rush into this just because everybody else is doing it. Like, I want to be as sure as I possibly can. And then I asked my wife to, and then I'll be honest, man, I was terrified to get married.
Mhm.
I was terrified to get divorced. I actually, here's how messed up my thinking was because of how I grew up. Marriage is the first step to divorce. I used to say that out loud. Like, that's how screwed up that was. And then when it became being a father, like I was terrified. Absolutely. Because I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I have a laundry list of things of what not to do. And to be honest, like I kind of thought that was enough, but I don't know about the rest of you guys. But the last time I went to Lowe's and bought a brand new barbecue pit and I opened up the manual, it didn't give me 100 ways not to put it together and best of luck. It gave me the exact instructions on how to do it. So I, for 6 years after my first son was born, my oldest was 6, my youngest was 4. I was lost, depressed, short on patience. My marriage was mediocre at best. Like I literally just thought like, well, everybody else is kind of doing this at an arm's length and disconnected, and marriage basically means like you don't really connect. So this is normal. Like that was my screwed up way of thinking about how this was all normal, and it wasn't.
How did you, I mean, that seems so challenging to overcome when your model was, as Andrew was referring to, chaos. If you can point to something, what was that thing that really helped you start to break the cycle of that? I mean, we see this kind of unfolding in society. If we kind of take a larger look at what's going on, fatherless household, and there seems to be that chaos, and then that cycle ends up repeating. What was it? Was there one thing that happened that you went, kind of put your foot down and said, not me, not now? And
Yeah.
what was that experience like?
Terrible. It was awful. Probably one of the darkest things I've ever experienced. And so I made an oath to myself when I had kids, and I kind of just made it quietly to myself. Like I was hit a lot by my mom, by my dad, by the men she dated, like people that moved in with us. And it was horrible, man. Like physical, mental, emotional abuse. And I always said to myself, I'm never going to strike my children out of anger ever, because I know what that's like. So, and of course, what we focus on grows. And I told you guys before we hit record today, I have a brand new book coming out called The Pursuit of a Legendary Fatherhood. My publisher asked, he's like, hey, I need you to write a description on the back of this book. I was like, okay, no problem. I wrote the description, and this is going to answer your question. And my publisher goes, we can't put that on the back of the book. And I was like, well, that's what's going on the back of the book. The first sentence on the back of my book said, in the darkest time of my whole life as a father, I became the monster that I swore to protect my kids against. So what happened was, I'll never forget it. My oldest was 6. My youngest was 4. He's 14 now. And what happened is that day I had a horrible day at work. I lost my number 1 customer in medical device sales. It was going to impact our income for the next 12 months. Like I was just in a horrible headspace. And plus marriage wasn't that great. It was a culmination of several different stressors. My 4-year-old stepped out of line, as any 4-year-old would, right? I mean, that's what they're supposed to do. I ended up spanking him on the butt, and I spanked him, but he lost his balance and he fell. And I was like, and it immediately triggered me. And I was like, oh my God, what did I just do? And I went to go help him up, and he looked at me like and shuddered like I was a monster. And I was like, what have I just done? And he's crying. I picked him up, and I was like, oh my God, what did I just do? So that night I went into this is where Dad Edge started. I went into my office. I'm crying. And what do you do when you're an adult and you have a bad moment? You go on Facebook and look at everybody else's highlights.
Yeah, to see
That's what I
how glorious everyone else's life is. Yeah.
Right. But this is how Dad Edge got started. So I'm on Facebook, tears in my eyes. I'm just scrolling through, just trying to forget everything. And I see this button in the left-hand corner that says create a page. And I'm a faith-based person. I think that there was some divine intervention there. And I clicked that button. I never created a page. Thing pops up, says, what do you want to name your page? And I didn't even think about it. I just typed out the Good Dad Project. And the Good Dad Project was me. I was the project. And I was just like, I need to figure this out. I don't know what the hell I'm doing. And I started thinking about things in my life that I was good at. And at the time, I was great at fitness. I I got my 4-year degree in sports medicine and nutrition. And at the time I think I was in my 11th year of martial arts. So, and I was good at martial arts. I started looking at those things in my job and I'm like, why do I excel in these areas? Well, it's because I have training. Like even if I take martial arts, I go to class twice a week. I have an instructor. I have someone who teaches me, guides me. I don't like try to wing it. Like I learn. Same thing with fitness and nutrition. Same thing with my job, training, right? You don't wing anything, right? Last time I looked, for you to be a cop, it takes 990 hours of training. No one shows up with just a uniform at the precinct saying like, hey, you'll figure it out best time of your whole life, right?
Yeah.
But that's what happens with fatherhood and marriage. So I decided in that moment, I'm like, I'm just going to go out and learn one new thing every day, and I'm just going to post it here. And I'm just going to do it for my own learning, my own diary, my own accountability. And never did it for a following ever. And then it got a lot of followers, and I was just being really real and authentic, like just basically saying what an idiot I always was and perfect I was. And I screwed this up, screwed that up. I just learned that. And then I started being asked to speak at churches by men's group and women's groups. And I was like, I'll never forget the first phone call I got. They're like, hey, will you come speak at our church? And I'm like, on what? And they're like, you're a good dad. I was like, you got the wrong guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's how it started.
That's really cool. I mean, and that's kind of the purpose of all this for Andrew and I is selfishly, it's like, how can we absorb material that will benefit us, and then hopefully we can share it with others in that process as well. And I think that's just such a great way to get the information out there. I kind of say this thing where it's like, if you're willing to do it for free, you're going to love getting paid for it, or you're going to love to all the things that come with that. And it sounds like you've kind of really found that niche. And another thing that kind of jumps out as you share that is the importance of having a mentor. And because you didn't have someone in this father role, was your wife's father someone that you looked up to, or maybe can you share some of that dynamic? And if not there, who were your mentors kind of as you've gotten to this point?
Yeah, great question. My wife's family is phenomenal. My in-laws have been married for over 40 years. Just an incredible family. If you go back, my wife's family, 4 or 5 generations, not one person has ever been divorced. Not one. It's crazy. I don't even think she knows of anyone in her family going back generations who have ever been divorced. And so they stick it out, right? So, and that's where my wife comes from. I would say though, the best mentor that I had, and I will tell you the best lessons in life, and this is great for fathers and moms to hear this. The best lessons in life are caught, not taught. So I didn't have a good father figure growing up. I mean, that part is obvious, right? But my mom's father, my grandfather, he only lived a mile from us. And, obviously he was married to my grandmother for 50 plus years. And I think he saw what was going on and he really stepped in, but he never said it. He just did it. And I was over at their house all the time. Like he picked me up from school every day. And my grandfather was a blue collar truck driver, tough man, but also very loving, very affectionate. He was always hugging me and showing me things. He's like, if he was fixing something, he'd be like, hey man, he's like, come over here. I'll show you how to do this. Come over here and help me with this. And the other thing too, is I really learned how to love a woman by watching him love my grandmother. Like that man loved my grandmother. He told her he loved her every day, told her how beautiful she was. He just looked at her like, you could just see it. You could feel it in the room. That being around him was the mentor. Like I still reference that, like experiencing that as a kid. And here's the cool thing. That's what I do for my boys with their mom. Like that's how I love her. And I love her very intentionally and publicly in front of my boys. So they see that.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the most important pieces to me is not only am I modeling that for my son, but I'm also modeling it for my daughter. So
Yeah.
I got one of each. You got three boys. I got one of each, and I had the question of how do you kind of what is the role and how does it differentiate as a father to your son versus to a daughter? And I'm sure you've worked with many people that have kind of gone through that or that you've asked that. But I think that's one of the most important things that we can do is modeling to my son the dad and husband that I would like to be, or that I hope that he improves upon at the very least. And then for my daughter, the husband that she pursues, and how she would hope to raise her sons. And I'm not saying that because I'm perfect in any of these, but as kind of like a default worst case scenario, I hope that, my best is at least as wait, how am I going to say this? Basically, I'm hoping that I'm modeling appropriately, both for my daughter and who to pursue, and then my son and who to be. And I'm not, one of the more important things that you've mentioned too is kind of the faith piece here. And I think that's where we can really get out of our own way. I know if I'm saying, hey, do it like I did, no, I'm not doing it right. And I fail and I mess up. But if we're trying to be Christ-like, there's a model that then takes me out of it, and someone who is flawless that we can look up to and pursue that life versus look at me and how good I am and what I'm doing,
Yeah. I think that, I mean, I've definitely over the past couple of years, I've gotten really in touch with that faith element in my life, and it's made a huge change in how I raise these young men and how I love my wife, and it's a foundational cornerstone of how we operate.
What was maybe if you can give an example, because and this is one of the things, folks, in reading the book that how raw Larry is and how much he shares, and maybe we'll get into some of that stuff, particularly in the latter half of the book. But can you share maybe before and after of what that looked like since diving in a little bit more and seeing having a maybe a stronger faith-based perspective, how that's changed your fathering?
Yeah, so it's the best. I think the easiest way I can explain this is I don't feel like I'm going at it alone.
Hmm.
I mean, yeah, I think when you don't have that faith foundation in your life, perhaps, and I don't want to speak for all people because there are a lot of people out there that aren't
They're
faith.
successful. Yeah.
Yeah, they don't practice faith.
Hmm.
In fact, I've gotten some hate because I talk about my faith, right? Or like I've even gotten a couple of podcast reviews of like, I can't stand the faith element in this podcast now, and I'm like, well, then don't listen to it.
Yeah.
Right? That's fine,
Yeah.
because it's not my job to please everybody. But what I can tell you is that it's helped me have the sense that I'm not going at this alone. And the other thing too is that I get to raise other faith-based, good, God-fearing young men along with me, right? So, I actually went through a mentorship over the past 2 years called Operation Timothy, and it's a mentorship. You basically, I'm a Timothy, and I had a Paul, and this Paul took me through this guided Bible study. That's a 2-year program. You actually have to graduate from it,
Hmm.
and to be honest, like I used to be very overwhelmed by I was raised Catholic, and faith has always been a part of my life, but I haven't always been into it. And I just didn't know how. I was very overwhelmed by it. There was even parts of me, I was like, well, I'm just not worthy of this. And, I mean, that's what the enemy wants us to think. But
Hmm.
I started really getting to know God and who he is and what he's all about. And I really got into it. And I just thought, now I've got this great relationship, with him, and it's really helped me. I just feel like he's always alongside of me now for this ride of raising these young men.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, I hate to try to boil this down in a podcast form, but what were some of those big pieces of getting to know God? What are there things that jumped out to you as things that made a difference for you in that walk?
Yeah. So, for me, I remember opening up the Bible and reading scripture. And I remember just scratching my head being like, what does this even mean? This is just so over my head. And then I would just give it up. I'm like, well, I just don't understand it. I don't know where to start. This Bible is this huge, thick book. Like, where to even begin? And it was through Operation Timothy that I really started getting into scripture, because what you do is you go through scripture, you go through exercises, you watch videos, and then basically what you do is you take that scripture and you interpret it. And, well, what does this actually mean in life? Right? What does this mean? So, like, for instance, one of my favorite verses is put on the full armor of God, so you can basically overcome the schemes of the devil. And I didn't even understand what that meant. But basically what it means is, you start your morning with prayer and you get into the word and you get into scripture, because temptation is going to come, right? Obstacles are going to be there. There are going to be challenges throughout the day. And if I am not suiting up, for that day, and if I'm not gearing up my mind, my heart, my soul for that day, I'm putting myself and my family at risk, right? Because those things, those temptations, those vices, those obstacles, those challenges, they're going to impact me, which is going to impact them. So I need to be on the ready.
One of the things that stood out for me in your voice in this book was perspective. You've had some crazy stuff go on. How do you have this positive outlook? That was one of the things that you talked about. Our thoughts and our thoughts are in our control. Like, how we approach a situation is within our control. And there's oftentimes things that are out of our control. Where did that come from? And how do we begin to foster and cultivate that skill? Because to me, it really is a skill, right? It's not, some people, I do think maybe they're naturally positive. But then there's people that kind of get into that cycle of woe is me, essentially. And how do you develop the skill of positive perspective to, because like you've given the scenario where you step into the situation and both people had a long day at work, and we can see this stuff on the ground as a hindrance and a frustration, or we can go, I'm going to sidestep all that and go straight to my wife, straight to my kids, and be like, how are you guys doing? So how do you develop that skill?
Well, you just said it. It's a skill. A lot of men, I think, view it as, well, it's a feeling. And if I don't feel up to it, well, then that's the equivalent of me just being a weak man. And I'm this, and I'm unworthy, and I'm that. And that's going to just spiral you down into a rabbit hole of darkness that you just, it's hard for you to come out of. Like, listen, I saw this video online. I actually did a podcast on it. It's not my content. I can't say it's my content. I can't remember who came up with it, but there's 3 types of men, right? The victim, the content zombie, and the executor. The victim will tell you all the reasons why they can't do something, right? It's because of their childhood, it's because of their challenges, it's because of their finances, because of their emotions. It's because, like, I had a guy email me, I kid you not. He used to actually be a part of our mastermind. He was there for 1 month. This was 4 years ago, 1 month, and he quit. He ended up emailing me last night saying, hey man, I really need some help. I just can't, I can't articulate my emotions, and it's because of my childhood. It's because of this, and it's because of that. Basically what he emailed me was his story, right? And his proof of why he can't. And I'm like, the first thing that entered my mind is, because you see that a mile away, you know what that is. And I'm like, no, you can. You absolutely can. The story you're telling yourself is the very thing that's preventing you from doing the thing that you want to do, right? So if you're a victim, what happens is I have these thoughts and these feelings. I am my thoughts. I am my feelings. I'm this. I'm unworthy. I'm that. And what the victim will do is they will not execute. And in fact, what they do is they actually look proactively. They don't know that they do this. They proactively look for proof, right? So if you say, I'm just not a good communicator, they'll actually go out and be like, oh, see, like, I couldn't tell my wife how I felt. See, I'm not a good communicator. And they'll actually look for the proof. The very thing that they're trying to overcome, they're actually looking to prove that it's true, right? That's how our minds work. That's how the default mind works. This is where skills come into play, right? Because you got to override that operating system. And the way you do that is through the skills that you learn. So then you have the content zombie. Now, I think content zombies, we have a ton of them nowadays, right? People are just binging on podcasts, and I have a podcast, but right? But they're binging on podcasts, YouTube videos, audiobooks, regular books. It's information. If I take in enough information, my life will change, right? And I got to give kudos to the content zombie. I was one at one point too. That's how I even moved into the world that I'm in now. But I thought, like, if I learn, my life will change. That's actually not true. I got to give kudos to the content zombie because they're hungry. They're like, I'm tired of being a victim and I'm ready to learn. But the missing piece is they don't know how to implement it. They don't know how to place it into their life and start to execute. And that's where the executor is. So the executor is like, all right, I just learned this from my coach. I just learned this from my mastermind. I just learned this from this book. I'm going to go do it. And it's going to become a part of not just me doing it. It's going to be a part of me being it. Right. I'll give you one example of that. If you're asking your wife, how was your day when you come home from work, please stop asking her that question. It's a terrible question that doesn't result in any high quality communication, zero connection, and zero intimacy. It takes zero brain power to ask that question, and it takes zero brain power for someone to answer you. So they're going to say, fine, good, busy, crazy, overwhelmed, whatever it is, right? Instead, if you're the content zombie and you learn one new thing, this is where the executor comes in. It's like, okay, well, I just learned. I'm not going to ask, how was your day? I want to ask, what was the best part of your day, and tell me why it was so meaningful. So I'm going to go do that. I'm going to go do that. And then the executor is like, okay, walks in the door, holds his wife by the hands, looks at her dead in the eye and says, babe, what was the best part of your day today? Tell me why it was so meaningful to you. Now, she might look at you like you have two heads because you don't do that on a regular basis, but keep doing it. Do those reps, right? But that's where the skills come in. It's where you do the thing to override the operating system that is trying to talk you out of doing that.
Like you mentioned, the idea of the best lessons are caught, not taught. That's kind of that takes us back to the same thing of action. And that's I'm learning that I tend to default into the content zombie a little bit myself, of having this curiosity and wanting to learn more. And it's easy for me to defend. Oh, it's good for me to learn more information, but if I don't put it into action, I don't actually ever really learn it. Right? It's until you put it into practice and work through, kind of stumble your way through that you actually ingrain those things and learn them. So I really like the importance of taking action on that is great. Larry, do you have fundamentals? Levi and I kind of focus around faith, family, fitness, and finance as our fundamentals you mentioned prayer earlier and the importance of starting your day there. That's one of the things I try to work through in the beginning of my day is, how am I doing in family? So how am I doing as a father and a husband? How am I doing in my relationship with God? How am I doing with fitness and finance? What are your fundamentals, and what does that look like for you in terms of what are you checking on? What questions are you asking yourself, et cetera?
Those are the exact ones that I have. I mean, I would say that it's definitely those core four, but if you look at what we do in Dad Edge, we call them the 5 dimensions. And the 5 dimensions, one is finances. One is health, but our faith is in that. So health encompasses physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health, right? Marriage. So the relationship I have with Jessica, so creating an extraordinary marriage, and there's several little pillars underneath that one. And then there's creating an incredible connection with my kids. That's number 4. And number 5 is leader, right? Being a leader. And that's truly that particular element is, and there's spiritual leader in there too, right? But that element, I'm always trying to sharpen the sword on that skill set, right? Because not only am I leading myself, but I need to do that very well, because I can go off all of us can go off the rails. If you are not sharpening that skill set of leading yourself, well, guess what? The rest of your life is probably going to fall apart. I have to be able to lead my wife. I have to be able to lead my kids, right? I have to be able to lead my team within Dad Edge. So I've got to be doing that correctly. But your core 4 are the same as mine. Within Dad Edge, we have the 5 that I mentioned.
Yeah. What are some of those practices that maybe, do you have like one practice for each of those, or sure, kind of your main things that you're working on to improve those? Maybe some habits that you do every day?
Yeah, my habit every day. So I'm holding up this journal. It's called the Daily Kairos. And I've been doing this now for quite some time, but basically it's my daily practice of getting the faith element in there. Right. And it takes me about 10 minutes I read the verse of the day. I read the reading of the day. I go through this 6-step process of dissecting prayer and my relationship with God and reflecting and that kind of thing. So it takes about 10 minutes. Physical fitness is a cornerstone of my life. It has been since I've been 17 years old. And kind of a funny story. You talk about fitness and relationships. My 14-year-old and I did and I'm happy to give you the details. We did a bodybuilding show together this past year.
Nice.
We need pictures.
Yeah.
What's that?
I said we need pictures.
Yeah, I got them. They're up there. And it was all his idea. It was literally all his idea. So fitness is a huge part of my life. I mean, even my wife and I, even today, you know, I usually take off early on Fridays. Today we're doing a 5-mile hike ruck, you know, together today. So fitness, I always get in something every single day. I never miss that. As far as connection with my kids, the thing that I always do is I'm not great about it every single day, but I would say I bat 9 out of 10. And I ask my kids 3 questions every day. And there's a whole psychological reason why I ask them these 3 questions. One is, tell me about the best part of your day, or tell me a high point moment of your day, or tell me something that made you smile or laugh today, or tell me something you're proud of today. I usually frame that first question because what I'm doing is I'm getting them into gratitude, right? And helping them. And the cool thing about the connection with that is when you're excited to share something that happened that's great, it brings the energy and the connection up with anybody. I mean, think about when we tell somebody something exciting, like, man, you'll never believe this, check this out. And then it doesn't matter who that person is, you feel more connected to them because of that energy. Second question is, tell me something you failed at today, right? Because I want to instill a growth mindset. I want to instill in my kids that, number one, it's okay to fail. Failure is part of the process, and we either win or we learn. So I love talking about failure with my kids because then they can articulate what it is they failed at and what they learned, and they get used to it, right? They don't have that fear. And then the final question is, what are you most excited about tomorrow? The cool thing about that question is that's usually one of the first questions I ask them about. So if they tell me like, man, we got the physical fitness test tomorrow, I'm really excited to see what I get my mile run. That's one of the first questions I'm going to ask them the next day, because that shows that their dad is in their life and he's very interested in what's going on with them. Like, hey man, how did the mile go today? Right. And so when it comes to my relationships, I love asking what I call, and I've got a training on this, a free training called generative questions, because it generates connection, intimacy, ideas, visions, goals, all these beautiful things if you know how to be a really good question asker.
Yeah, I think this speaks to the importance of intentionality. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is, how do you set boundaries and how do you balance the spending intentional time with the kids with work? There's a lot of people that now work from home. I know Andrew and I do. And so we see our families quite a bit. And they'll want to come in at my kids are homeschooled. So they'll want to come in at 10 o'clock when I'm working, and I want to be intentional with them and I want to engage with them, but I also need to work. So how have you kind of balanced or worked through that, or guided people through that process of not the, hey, I'll do that with you later, all the time, and then you end up not doing it? Or hopefully you know where I'm going with this, but how do you set those boundaries, and how do you stay intentional but still get your work done, essentially?
I think a lot of it has to do with, you have to keep your promises within the containers of time that you operate within. So like, you know, we have a saying in our mastermind group, show me your calendar and I'll show you what's important to you. Right. So I keep everything personal on my calendar as well as work related, and I work in containers of time. So like, for instance, I work from 8 to 3 or 4, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday. Wednesday, I stop working at 1, and Fridays I stop working at 11. And I do that because I want to spend time while my kids are at school. I spend time with my wife on Wednesdays and Fridays. And now here's the thing. My wife's not going to come in here, and neither are my kids during those hours. If my kids need something, sure they will. In fact, kind of a funny thing, Chris Voss, he used to be the chief hostage negotiator for the FBI. I had him on the podcast. My 8-year-old came in and was like, hi, Chris. And that was great. He loved it. But you know, every now and again, those interruptions are going to happen, but that's okay, because with my brand and what I do, I wouldn't say I welcome those interruptions, because they could be all the time if I allow them, but it's a part of my life, right? And I'm not going to tell a kid to get out of my office. I'm going to, you know, but I'll be like, hey man, like, can we do this when I get down here at 3? But here's where I think it's most important. It's great to have boundaries around work, right? And kids, I honestly think kids need to respect that, right? At the same time, you need to respect your boundaries and their boundaries around personal time. So like, for instance, I am not going to even bring my phone on this hike with my wife. I don't want to feel it buzz. I don't want to hear it go off. I don't even want to be tempted to check it, because my goal is to operate in that container of time 100% with her. On Wednesday nights, every Wednesday night, I take my 2 little boys to go play soccer up at the soccer field, the 3 of us. I'm not going to bring my phone. I'm not going to be checking emails. I'm going to be playing soccer with them. So the best gift that I could possibly give my kids is, when I'm with them, I need to honor that time and not be distracted. And it's hard. And I'm not always great at it, but I really try to do that as best as I possibly can.
Yeah, presence. Instead, the best present you can give is presence. It's a challenge in today's world with this amazing little device that we have in our pockets. But Larry, you mentioned on that same vein, kind of a few things that I really like. Some of the practices I wrote down my favorite dad keys that you had listed here: spending one-on-one time with each kid daily, and a yearly one-on-one adventure. And one of the things Levi and I were chatting about kind of briefly beforehand was, we're curious. So giving you a little bit of background, I've got a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old. Levi's got an 8 and a 6. And so you're a little bit ahead of us. And so I'm curious, how has that changed? Has any of that changed? What do some of those practices look like? You mentioned playing soccer with your little ones and things like that. Are there changes that you've made at all to those kind of, whether it be daily, weekly, monthly, yearly type of things that you're doing with your kids?
Yeah. So, when I wrote the book, The Dad Edge, I mean, I kind of call that book like your most basic toolkit ever. In fact, the book is I've actually have thought about taking the book off of Amazon, because I feel like, man, it's kindergarten compared to like what we are doing today, right? And I think right now we're doing is like more like master's degree, PhD type stuff, right? We're so in depth with what we do now. Plus, when I wrote Dad Edge, I had 2 boys and not 4. So the dynamics are a bit different. However, yearly trips, those still happen. Weekly interactions, those still happen. One of the things I do every Sunday is I have a planner, and I gamify my week. So I have points that I can earn for certain things that I go accomplish. So like, for instance, I'll put a point system like, hey, I get 1 point if I spend one-on-one time with my 8-year-old on Wednesday night playing soccer with him, while my other one is a practice, right? Like, we're just practicing right next to him, and then we all play together. And in order for me to do that, I get a point for that, right? So I'll gamify it. The same thing, like, my older boys are a bit more busy now. So I have one both of them are in high school. One plays football, the other one's in band. So their schedules are pretty darn tight nowadays. And if they're not at school or in practices, then they're at that age now, they want to be with friends. However, I get to take my 14-year-old to school every single day. So I'm talking to him on the way to school, right? So to me, that's time well spent. I definitely I take my 2 older boys for trips as well as the younger ones once a year. But if I can't, as they get older, the weekly interactions get a little bit harder because their schedules are tighter. However, what I'll do is have a touch point with them at least every day, where I'm asking them those questions or creating this environment of psychological safety where we can have, these really great conversations. A lot of times I'll do it right before they go to bed at night. I'll just go in their room, just hang out with them, just talk to them, use humor, but also connect with them on a high level. And I make sure that they're doing 90% of the talking, and I do that it's the skill set of asking generative questions to get them talking.
You mentioned that before, and that was one of the things that I was curious about. So one of the ways I try to start my day with my son, my 6-year-old, is we go outside first thing in the morning, kind of looking at the sky, looking at the sunset or sunrise, and trying to identify something we're grateful for. And one of the challenges with that is sometimes he doesn't want to be there, right? Sometimes it turns into this task where it's like, okay, Dad, sure, the sky, the trees. How do you deal with, I'm sure there are times where your sons are just like, Dad, I don't want to do this right now. How do you handle that? And how do you turn that into still a valuable time where you can ask those generative questions and hopefully provide value both for the relationship?
Yeah. So I think sometimes you just have to read your kid a little bit, right? So I have teenagers right now, and, it just depends on, their mood. You know, that's about the best way I can describe it. Like, I think it's safe to say that it's not even just a kid thing. It's a human being thing, right? I mean, like we're our age, right? But at the same time, there are times where it's just like, I don't really want to have this conversation right now. In fact, I would just really like to sit with you quiet. Like sometimes that is the greatest gift we can give our kids. And an example of that is my 16-year-old. He's the easiest conversationalist I think I've ever. He just never wants to be quiet. He loves to talk, and I love that. Like our conversations come very easy. It's insanely easy. And for him, for he and I, it's effortless. My 14-year-old is a lot like my wife. He's very introverted and he's very stoic. And there are times where he's really in the mood to talk, and there are times where it's exhausting for him to talk. And what I do with him, especially, is I read those moments, because if I try to force him to talk through generative questions when he's not in the mindset to talk and he's trying to recharge, I'm actually doing the relationship. I'm actually stressing the relationship more than I'm doing it good. So sometimes the greatest gift I can give my son, you know, even if it's on the way to school, is just to be quiet with him. And sometimes it's just me putting my hand on his leg, you know, just being like, hey man,
I'm here.
I love you. And I hope you have a great day at school today. Or I just say something I appreciate about him. Like, hey man, like, I just want to let you know that I saw you do this yesterday. So like, I'll look at him through what we call an appreciative lens. I saw you do this yesterday and I just thought it was amazing. I just want to let you know that. And I don't expect anything in return out of that, but I'm just letting him know, like, I know you're quiet. I know you're recharging, and I'm here and I love you. And that's it. Yeah. So I think sometimes you just have to read it.
Yeah. So you're dealing with teens, and you're talking about reading them. And so maybe you know where I'm going with this. How do you have the tough convos? That's something that as my kids are still young enough that those tough conversations aren't necessarily there yet, but they're getting close. They're curious. And it's not just necessarily one topic like the birds and the bees, but how have you approached having those difficult conversations with them? And I know for me in the past, or in some of the mentors that I've been around, it's really been that intentional time that you're taking each week. Like it might be that Wednesday night, but if there's something else, or if that is, or how do you have the tough conversations with your kids?
It depends on the conversation. It really, really does. And I'm not trying to avoid your question, but I think I'm getting to the basis of your question. If you want to have a tough conversation with your kid or anybody, one of the skill sets that I teach is how to create an environment of psychological safety. An environment of, and here's what that looks like in its most basic form. If you guys have ever been told, which I'm sure that you have, man, I don't know what it is about you, Levi, but I feel like I could tell you anything. If you've ever been told that, it's because you have created an environment of psychological safety where that person feels safe from judgment, blame, or pain to tell you whatever it is that's on their mind, to bring up ideas, to bring up questions, or a story, right? And there's a skill set. You can actually manufacture that with your kids, right? So, and then the other on the flip side, if you've ever verbal vomited all over somebody because you felt so comfortable talking to them, right? And you walk away and like, oh my God, I can't believe I said that. It's because that person provided an environment of psychological safety. But there's a way that you can, so like for instance, that second question that I told you about, tell me something you failed at today. The reason I do that is for two reasons. Number one, I want them to have a growth mindset and learn from failure. Number two, that is a daily rep that I want to get into my kids. So I'll give you an example of what that looks like to create psychological safety. In other words, you can tell me anything and you are not going to be judged. You are not going to be blamed, and I'm not going to throw pain. And I'll give you an example. I'll ask my 16-year-old, and this is a true story. It happened just last week. Hey man, tell me something that was tough on you today. And you see it, you're like, and he, you know, he doesn't want to tell you. He's like, I got my science test back today. I'm like, oh, okay. Tell me more. I didn't say, what happened? I said, tell me more. Tell me more is an invite. Tell me more triggers psychological safety. Tell me more is like, yeah, what you got, man? Right? And it'll be like, I got a D on it. Okay. Yeah. Tell me more about that. Again, inviting, right? Not saying, what do you mean you got a D? That's how I was raised, right? That's how we were raised. And he'll be like, I got a D. I'm like, okay, well, why do you think that is? You know, tell me about that. And he's like, I don't know, Dad. And like, there's just questions on there that I guess I wasn't prepared for. And what I'll do is I'll just mirror him, be like, you weren't prepared? Yeah, I really wasn't prepared. Like, I don't really know if I studied all that well. I was like, man, that's really fantastic awareness. So when you say you didn't study enough, like, what does that mean? I don't know. I only studied, chapters 1, 2, and 3, and it was over 6 chapters. I kind of neglected the 3rd chapter. I was like, you know what? That's great for you to know. That's actually great information. So let me ask you this. If you were able to study for this test all over again, what would you do different? I would study all 6 chapters. And I think that's a great idea. I was like, well, when's your next test? Well, my next test is in 2 weeks. I was like, okay, well, based on the information that you've learned, what would you do different? And I would study everything. I would study all 6 chapters. And I think I'm going to do that. I'm like, dude, that's a great idea. Now, listen, what I basically did is I used generative questions for him to lecture himself. I didn't have to lecture him to be like, well, this is what you got to do. This is what you have to do. And blah, blah, blah. He said it, not me. And then I follow that up with, I think that's a great idea. How can I best support you in that? What feels right? Do you want me to check in on you? You want me to quiz you? You want me to just hold you accountable? What feels right to you? And I use that word, what feels right, because kids are feeling people. And it'd be like, man, if you could quiz me the night before, that'd be great. Done. Let's do it, man. Nux. And then he walks away from that conversation like, holy crap, I just told my dad something that I wasn't proud of. And all he did was welcome me with a really nice voice tone of curiosity. He asked me really good questions, and I learned from it.
Yeah,
And
now I have a solution.
Right. I didn't have to give him this. I mean, I knew the solution. And of course, there's that dad brain in me, right? Be like, when he told me you got a D, there's that. This is where you got to override the operating system with skill sets. Like, there's a part of me that's like, dude, I freaking saw you on your phone all night. And I know you weren't studying. Why weren't you studying? I told you to get off your phone. There's that part of me, but I'm going to override that because what I want is the relationship, not necessarily beat him down with the lesson.
Yeah. And then you're teaching him, you're walking him through that catch or caught a lesson. How is that phrased?
Exactly.
Best lessons are caught, not taught. Instead of lecturing him and hammering over the head, you're showing him how to do that, which I love that, man. Larry, we could go for much further and get into a lot more topics. There's a lot of good stuff here that you've given us. I know you got to get running though, but I want to give you the chance to let our listeners know where they can find you, what you're working on right now, and kind of what you got coming up.
Oh, thank you very much. If you're a podcast listener, the podcast is the Dad Edge podcast. It's been around for 7 years. You can find it everywhere, like literally everywhere. I don't think there's any channel we're not on right now. If you need resources, head on over to thedadedge.com. I talked a lot about generative questions in this podcast, and what I'll tell you is I've got a free resource. It's called 25 Intimate Conversation Starters. It's generative questions for your marriage and for your wife. If you want to feel like you're dating your wife again, you can find that free resource over at thedadedge.com/25 questions. That's 25 questions. It'll lead you right there. Pop in your name and email. There's no charge for it. I don't want a thing from you. Actually, I do want a thing from you. That training will be followed up with a few emails of how are these questions working for you, different ways to use them. Hit the reply button and let me know how they're working. I love getting the reply. I answer every single email that comes my way. And when you reply to me and tell me what's going on, I love hearing the stories.
Solid.
That's great stuff, man. Larry, we really appreciate your time. And like I said, I think we may need to do this again because I've got a lot more questions for you, but I thank you for the time that you spent with us today and sharing your wisdom. So
thanks,
all
Larry.
the best. As always, we appreciate the time you took to listen to this episode, and we want to challenge you to identify one action you can take from this conversation to implement in your own life today. For me, this will be trying out some of Larry's 25 generative questions in conversations with my wife, as well as exploring some of the additional resources on his website and podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone else who you think might benefit. Our goal is to reach more parents and provide tools and practices that will improve families and communities. So we greatly appreciate your help in spreading the word. Thanks, everybody.